Let's take a look at horizontally stretching and shrinking our graphs. So we have our amplitude. Looking at our amplitude of the graph here, we notice that there is no value in the front, so our amplitude is 1. Now our period, we have something here. We have a b value. Remember that our period is 2 pi over b. In this case, b is 2. So to solve for it, we have 2 pi over 2, or our period is pi. So our transformation is that this is a horizontal shrink by a half. It's the reciprocal. If you remember, all horizontals are always reciprocal. So now we are changing what our period is. So instead of 2 pi, our period is pi. So we'll start with pi. Pi is the first one out, 4 out, so that's pi. Half of pi is pi over 2. Half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. And then this one over here is going to be 3 pi over 4. Again, if you think about that, this is pi over 4. This is 2 pi over 4, which ends up being pi over 2. This is 3 pi over 4, which is what that is. And then we have 4 pi over 4, which is just pi. So if you think about it that way, that's how you would divide it into 4 equal parts. Our amplitude is 1. So I'm going to go ahead and keep 1. I'll do it here for now. 1 and negative 1. Cosine starts at the amplitude. So our amplitude is positive 1. We start there. Then it goes down. Then it goes down 1 more. Then it goes up to the 0. And then at pi. So here is our curve for the horizontal shrink for cosine 2 of x. Let's graph cosine 2 pi of x. Again, the amplitude is still 1. The period, now this is interesting, b is 2 pi. So remember, the period is 2 pi over b, so it's 2 pi over 2 pi. So therefore, our period is 1. So our what's the transformation is it's a horizontal shrink by 1 over 2 pi. But it's okay. We're just going to scale our graph. So 4 out is 1. Half of 1 is 1/2. Half of a half is 1/4. And then this one will be 3/4, right? Between 1/2 and 1 is 3/4. And then our amplitude is 1 and negative 1. Again, our cosine starts at the amplitude of 1. So 1, then it goes down to 0, down to the negative 1, up to 0, then up at 1. So there is our curve. So I want you to go ahead to try, see if you can do graphing sine of 2x and sine of pi over x in your notebook. Pause it, and then when you come back, the answers will be here. So here are the graphs for sine of 2 of x and sine of pi over x. Notice that for example number 2, the period changes to pi, so it's pi, pi over 2, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. And then for the next one, we had b is pi. So you divide that from 2 pi over pi, you get 2 as your period. Just label as 2, cut 2 in half to 1. Then you have a half, and then that third one is 3/2. So many of you are probably noticing the pattern here, that if this is 1/2, whatever the denominator is, you just put a 3 on top of whatever the denominator is. Notice it's the same here, pi over 4, so we just make it 3 pi over 4. So now let's take a look at doing both vertical and horizontal stretches and shrinks. So we'll do 2 shifts at the same time. So our amplitude in this case is the a value. So our a value is 2. The period is 2 pi over our b, which is 2, so the period is pi. So we talk about our transformations. It's a vertical stretch by 2, and then it's also a horizontal shrink by a half. And since our period is pi, so I start with pi is here. Half of pi is pi over 2. Half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. Then we have 3 pi over 4. Our amplitude is 2. Now, just remember, think about what you're graphing. So sine starts at 0. So we start here. Then we go up to 2, down to pi over 2. At 0, and then down to negative 2 for 3 pi over 4, and then now we were at 0 at pi. And then we draw our smooth curve. So here is our graph of 2 sine of 2x. Let's do 1/2 cosine of 2 pi x. Our amplitude is 1/2. The period, 2 pi over 2 pi, therefore our period is 1. So we have a vertical shrink by a half, and then a horizontal shrink by 1 over 2 pi. So I'm going to label this as 1/2, 1, negative a half, negative a half, and this is negative 1. And then our period is 1. So here's 1, half of 1 is half, 1/4, and therefore this is 3/4. Cosine. Now cosine starts at the amplitude. So therefore it starts at a half, then a fourth. Then at a half we're at negative a half, 3/4 we're here, and then we're back up at a half for 1. So here is our graph of 1/2 cosine 2 pi x. So try out these last two at the bottom. Graph 2 sine of pi of x and also 1/4 of cosine 2x on your own. Pause the video. Then when you return, the answers will be here. Here are the graphs for g of x equals 2 sine pi of x, and here is 1/4 cosine of 2 of x. So make sure on the homework, go ahead and do the homework on paper so that we get practice on graphing.